I would begin with asking you, for a common man who is listening to this discussion, what is international relations? For a common man.
So basically, a common man would look as being a citizen of a state and his state interacting with other states. What does he have to say about that? And basically, we see, moving beyond Westphalia, international, so the nation state as the identity of the state, the responsibility, the character, the compulsions on the state. So the states interact within those parameters. And in many cases, an individual may think that this is what I would prefer my state to do. This is what I would regard the idea of international system and order. But this type of a discipline provides bare minimum of what an individual expects, and few things where he would prefer some kind of a change. So it, in that way, makes a sense to it. And obviously, with the rise of new states and international system, states interact with each other according to that pattern.
In other words, हम ये कह सकते हैं कि जो states हैं interact कर रही हैं और उनकी interaction को जो discipline govern कर रहा है, that is international relation.
कहा जा सकता है. It's a bit more than that, इसलिए कि international relations में जिस तरह से अब सब और paradigms और disciplines further evolve हुए हैं, उसमें ideally वो नहीं है जिस तरह से international relations evolve हुआ था. हाँ, international itself एक ऐसी term है जिसको अब आजकल जिस तरह नई debates आ रही हैं, question किया जा रहा है कि nation state क्यों सबसे बड़ा एक हमने construct बना लिया. Individuals, बल्कि all living forms in that way, interspecies relations की अब term आ गई है जिस
बिल्कुल बहुत broad हो जाता है.
बहुत broad हो जाता है. तो उसमें फिर who are we as individuals and our leaders as representing us and our states to decide what should be the agenda. तो वो इधर जाके थोड़ा सा conflict भी. But within the discipline, as we say, international relations, obviously we look at how post-Westphalia, the role and character of the state, the interaction of the states, diplomacy, war, peace, balance of power, वो सारी चीज़ें जिस तरह से आती हैं, we see that as a part overall of this discipline of our international relations. लेकिन इसमें दो terms हैं. एक simple interstate relations है, एक वो knowledge है जो हमने इकट्ठा किए as a result of our observation of how states interact with each other.
ठीक है.
तो वो usually it's आजकल तो छोटे upper and lower case से दोनों लिखे जाते हैं. But when you write IR international, capital I, it would mean that knowledge, that body of knowledge which helps us understand. तो वो है जिसमें वो चीज़ें जैसा मैंने basically बताई हैं.
तो for a person जो international relations की field से directly related नहीं है, for instance कोई diplomat नहीं है, कोई academic नहीं है, student भी नहीं है, is it important for them to study and know about IR? Just the basics of IR.
It'll be useful for them because it extends all the way. The social formations extend all the way from individuals, associations, groups, states, and the Committee of Nations in it. So the more he knows about those, the more he's likely to have a better opinion about what the international system is, what are the compulsions on the state because of international institutions evolving, and how do those regulate or in some ways guide international behavior, states' behavior, international practices, and how they ultimately trickle down all the way to the individual. How are individuals affected by decisions that are taken by states, international institutions, few things which are compulsions on their particular state and which ultimately affect them. So they can in some ways be better informed, and knowledge obviously in that way is power.
और हम ये कह सकते हैं कि अगर किसी ने पढ़ा हुआ है IR को और समझा हुआ है और उनके पास एक थ्योरेटिकल नॉलेज भी है, जो थेरीज़ क्या होती हैं हम आगे डिस्कस करेंगे, लेकिन क्या हम ये कह सकते हैं कि उनको एक प्रेडिक्शन मिल सकती है कि जी ये थोड़ी सी प्रिंसिपल्स हैं, लॉज हैं जो कि इन स्टेट्स के इंटरेक्शंस को गवर्न कर रहे हैं, तो शायद फ्यूचर में स्टेट्स इसी तरह से बिहेव करें और मुझे एज एन इंडिविजुअल अपने बिहेवियर को, ट्रेजेक्ट्री को उसके मुताबिक शेप करना चाहिए?
Prediction is a very strong word. It's usually not seen as the objective in social scientific research. But when we talk about social scientific knowledge, so all of these are parts of social scientific knowledge. The primary assumption being that if we have to understand how people interact, what do they think, what makes them unite on certain things specific, then there is something which was an outcome of a constructivist point of view, outcome of how people interacted, and a knowledge it was extracted out of the understanding of that social behavior. And that ultimately into groups, states, and international system of states. So if you have knowledge of that particular dense, thick type of knowledge and science, it is useful to help us understand. So social observer, social behavior ki observer ki main objective understanding hai, not as much prediction. If you're understanding, if you're able to understand something better, then you don't necessarily have to predict. You are in a better position to know what is affecting this and what is leading to this kind of social behavior. Prediction is possible, but it is very difficult in social sciences because of the huge diversity. Not necessarily the diversity is a negative thing, but it makes it very complex.
Diversity
of everything, individuals, the influences on them, their ideologies, their motivations, the groups, different types. So you cannot generalize that this is one construct to help us understand this particular type of social behavior. So it may be relevant to a very specific group of people in specific circumstances, but may not be relevant to others. In that way, diversity makes it difficult for the application of social scientific knowledge to study social behavior. But it is not necessarily a limitation. The complexity in social sciences is the beauty in some ways.
Yes, the beauty of social sciences. और ये इस चीज़ को काफ़ी ज़्यादा एक ऐसी फील्ड बनाती है जिसमें हम मेहनत कर सकते हैं, मज़ीद एरियाज़ को एक्सप्लोर कर सकते हैं.
Again, जिस तरह social facts हैं, your terms हैं, which help us understand. I like to give this as a body of knowledge which we use to understand social behavior. The terms which are at the core of that body of knowledge were not coined, but the understanding of those were there. So like we said, beauty, diversity, implying that there's this need to get into it, delve into it to understand it. And if you're able to come up with an explanation, a term more so, then it'll be the basis for understanding how this behavior can be changed for the better, if that is the objective or the ultimate interest of social sciences.
So for now ये है कि अगर कोई शख्स IR को पढ़ता है, समझता है, तो उनके लिए एक अंडरस्टैंडिंग बेहतर बन सकती है. For now we can summarize at this stage.
My interest was sociology, political science, history, and I saw this as the ultimate, at that stage, evolved body of knowledge specific to this. So that was my reason for saying that this is a good field of study to be engaged in. I don't know whether everyone shares that, but as I would also say, for an individual, like ancient philosophers were also scientists, they were also interested in studying the human body. So humans' quest for knowing can be focused on these things. Who am I, my physical side, intellectual side, why I form such associations, what's the purpose? And I think the high point of that can be, in the current times, how we see that evolving into states, system of states, and a knowledge which helps us understand, because they are all connected all the way from top to the individual.
तो अभी at this stage I suppose जो कि सबसे ज़्यादा की इवेंट डिस्कस हो रहा है इंटरनेशनल पॉलिटिक्स में, दैट इज़ रशियन यूक्रेन वॉर. मे बी अगर हम एशिया की बात ले लें तो पाकिस्तान इंडिया रिलेशंस, कभी पीस कभी नॉट सो पीसफुल रिलेशंस. लेकिन इस वक्त ग्लोबली कौन से ऐसे चैलेंजेस हैं जो कि इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस के स्कॉलर्स का फोकल पॉइंट बने हुए हैं उनकी रिसर्च का, कि दे आर ट्राइंग टू अंडरस्टैंड इट? US China relations, competition, etc.
My own interest, and I think these two are very, very critical, are firstly, if we can understand conflict and war. Why does conflict and war occur? It's a recurring trend in international relations. Realists will not be delving in the moral justification for war, but there is this huge discourse has been about whether use of force can be morally justified. I think this is a very critical thing and a huge challenge for all social scientists to understand the causes of war. If we can understand those, perhaps we can do something to minimize them.
Okay.
Justification for war was seen as one all the way from Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. The other is that there's a huge amount of money in the world and huge amount of buying and selling and all, and things about having gone to the moon, going to Mars, exploring the space. But the basic challenge is if we can understand the causes of poverty. And if we understand the causes of poverty, we can eliminate poverty. So to me, these actually are the two most. In Ukraine's case, again, basically, can we understand why Russia has their own point of view, NATO has its own, Europe has its own, United States will have its own point of view, why they did that. But ultimately what happened was a conflict, a war, all-out war.
Okay.
And if you see in South Asia, all over the globe, there's this huge amount of poverty gradually increasing over the past two decades, and now taking a very strong pace towards new manifestations in poverty, and no clear answer to that. What are the causes of poverty? In addition to those, then there is environment, ecological, world citizenship, there is global identity, many such questions which basically are at the core related to conflict and inequality. So I still would relate many of these ultimately to these two critical questions about whether we know what are the causes of war and conflict. And this still is in the theoretical and philosophical terrain. In practical terrain, and a practical person would not be much interested in war and causes of war. They see war as occurrence, poverty as existing, and having their own explanations about why they are poor and why states and their nations go to war and what are their different manifestations of war and conflict these days.
आम लोग आई सपोज के वॉर को देखेंगे कि क्यों हुई है और वो बता देंगे कि ये इसका ट्रिगर पॉइंट था। लेकिन सिमिलरली अगर पावर्टी की बात की जाए उसमें भी कहेंगे कि जी शायद लोगों के पास पर कैपिटा इनकम कम है, ये कह देंगे ना। तो आई सपोज़ कि जो मैं अखज़ कर पाया हूँ डिस्कशन से वो ये है कि फ़िलोसोफर्स जो एकेडमिक्स देखते हैं कि फ़िलोसॉफिकली कौन से ऐसे आइडियाज़ हैं जो कि ऐसी स्टेट पे ला रहे हैं। आइडियाज़ की रेम में जाके वॉर को अंडरस्टैंड किया जाए कि क्यों हो रही है।
Academics have this luxury of engaging with theoretical and philosophical, but obviously all that is philosophical and theoretical has to be and can be related basically to the individual's primary questions, primary need. So in that way, you are right to understand from what I've said that academics, practitioners are more interested in the theoretical and philosophical discourse of why. But if an individual is to be asked a simple question of from what and how to why, then that question of why is actually a very philosophical one as well. Why are you not able to change your conditions of things and move to something else and improve your livelihood? Why do you feel compelled to react in this manner, which may be seen as violent? So basic questions to state, international system से philosophical from what, how to why, तो philosophical वही हैं. Assumption in IR की ये है कि academics, practitioners or leaders are relatively, they are well informed, they've got access to more knowledge and they are acculturated to a degree that they are in a better position to do something about these.
ठीक है।
Layman से expect नहीं किया जा सकता ना, किया तो जा सकता है लेकिन वो शायद खुद ना समझ सके कि मैं क्या कर सकता हूँ और मुझे क्या करना चाहिए। तो इस स्टेट का और इस नॉलेज अबाउट दिस स्टेट एंड द इंटरनेशनल सिस्टम की असम्पशन यही है मेरे ख्याल से, that those who are in better position to have access over this knowledge and are able to use that knowledge and even and to a certain degree improve this knowledge, जो हम social scientists की कोशिश होती है, the purpose of that should be to identify these two critical, मेरे ख्याल से, questions.
तो ये नॉलेज किसी तरह से उनकी पॉलिसी मेकिंग को, दुनिया की अंडरस्टैंडिंग को अफेक्ट करता है? कोई नॉलेज में ख़राबी है? जैसे हम कह सकते हैं कि रियलिस्ट थेरी पैराडाइम बहुत ज़्यादा डोमिनेट करता है आईआर को, और लेटर हम डिस्कस करेंगे कि रियलिज़म वगैरह क्या है। लेकिन जैसे आपने कंस्ट्रक्टिविज़म की भी बात की है कि आइडियाज़ में इश्यूज़ हैं, उन असल मटेरियल चीज़ों में कम, और आइडियाज़ जो उन मटेरियल चीज़ों से रिलेटेड हैं उनमें ज़्यादा इश्यूज़ हैं। तो ये नॉलेज में कुछ इशू है जिसकी वजह से रियल वर्ल्ड भी उसी तरह से ट्रांसफॉर्म कर रहा है और एक्ट कर रहा है।
So if you take any school of thought, any ideology, this is one thing out of three which I explained in some of our lectures at the university. One of these is that there is this agreement among all schools of thought, whether it's realism, liberalism, constructivism, neoliberalism, feminism, Marxism, postmodernism, all of the isms, is that there is this absolute knowledge, या उसको आप absolute ethics कह सकते हैं,
ठीक है,
and there are these contingencies where it should have applied, but now the change in circumstances demand that it should be rethought. It's not seen necessarily as a deficiency. This is how knowledge, what we have till now, has evolved. So not to say that knowledge is deficient. Yeah, it's not right, it's not on sound ground, or it's corrupted. But to see that as a natural process of the evolution of knowledge, that contingencies to which it is supposed to apply, the knowledge stands too abstract to those. Just now, Jim Boucher के जैसा आपको एक चैप्टर भी था, political theories of international relations.
Exactly.
ये चीज़ सब में common है. So, like the whole term reified exemplars जो sociological critique of consciousness में है. So they basically see that as how we see knowledge evolving. When you see, जो सामने का, knowledge should apply to something, the structures are there, and the structure should serve some purpose. If they are not serving the purpose, either the structure has to be changed,
ठीक है,
or the purpose has to be redefined. So the redefinition of purpose will be in the domain of knowledge, but once the structure is newly changed, newly created, and it delivers, then obviously new factors are created. And our knowledge of those new factors, how they apply, experimentation, long-term observation, is then improving our knowledge about that thing, the epistemology of it, so to speak.
Right.
And that is where we see the structure changed and the knowledge about. So not just the knowledge to be evolved, but the structure simultaneously also improved and evolved. And this is actually what is going on, and should actually be the purpose of all social sciences and IR more so.
कोई ऐसा एग्जाम्पल जिसमें स्ट्रक्चर इवॉल्व हुआ हो और नॉलेज साथ में इवॉल्व हुआ हो, लेकिन ऐसा भी एग्जाम्पल जिसमें स्ट्रक्चर इवॉल्व कर गया हो, नॉलेज इवॉल्व ना किया हो और उसकी वजह से कोई इशू हो गया हो?
This happens in all the cases.
So
obviously, I usually give many examples such as rights and Weberian concept of creation of rights, and the notion of justice, and how justice was initially seen as retributive, and then you see the temporality of the injustice, which demands an inquiry into not the recovery of the thing or giving it back, but how the time when it was taken away affected those who were owners, those who were depending on it, and those who benefit, let's say, from the production and the exchange, the political economic side of it. So knowledge about justice was based on retributive sense, and the inquiry into what happened while it was taken away led to the understanding of restoration and distribution. So the structure had to be evolved in order to ensure not just retribution, but restoration and distribution as well. So knowledge evolved and structure had to be changed. Now you're saying structure evolved, but the knowledge remained deficient?
Did not evolve, और उसकी वजह से कोई implication, adverse implication.
That is in the first side of it, basically. So the structure suggested that injustice can be mitigated by retribution.
Retribution for the listeners?
So retribution is, say, something is taken away, an injustice is done, that thing is returned. Now, there's a basic definition of justice, keeping things at their right place. So what is the right place? But at that particular time, who would say, oh yeah, eye for an eye, tooth for a retribution. So temporality is missing there. When you say the structure was there, abhi hai, parliament hai, a body of law hai, and it is a structure, parliament, judiciary, legislature, they're there, and if there's some new eventuality or contingency, then obviously it suggests that the structure and knowledge was there, but these new challenges demand a rethinking, evaluation, evolution, refinement, various things, which are seen as how knowledge ought to evolve.
Abhi, we can move to theories of international relations. Before discussing them individually, theories होती क्या हैं IR में? Why are they created? And how do they help us view the outer world in a better way than otherwise?
You know, when I started studying IR, so our teacher of IR theories said something very simple, that someone may say that if somebody comes in and asks permission for something or asks, so what is a theory behind it? It looks like something very simple. But there's a theory behind it as well. So technically, theory is there. It precedes the action in some ways as well. And then what social behavior and action is, it leads to the development of theory as well.
दोनों एक दूसरे को कॉम्प्लीमेंट कर रहे हैं.
लेकिन ये ज़रूर है कि ये हो सकता है कि किसी बिहेवियर को आप ये पहले ना कह सके कि इसके पीछे क्या थ्योरी है. तो टेक्निकली तो है, एंड सिर्फ IR की थ्योरी नहीं है. दिस इज व्हाट आई लाइक टू क्लैरिफाई इन द क्वेश्चन दैट यू आस्क्ड. वी शुडंट से दैट IR theory. IR theory is there, but all of the theories of IR ultimately can be traced to something from sociology, psychology, anthropology, history, historiography. In that way, the primary question is basically, theory is, what is theory? That it is a more refined, dense form of knowledge which has been created as a result of observation of social behavior.
So, yeah.
So constructivists would say it then detaches itself from social and becomes a body in its own, to be used to study social behavior and, if possible, to try to change it for the better.
So, yeah.
Basically theory hai. There's some element of logic there. Based on that logic, which shows a simple cause and effect, a simple acceptance of something which is rule. So, few things which are basic rule of thumb in the material world that we see. So people subscribe to those, they comply, and they see themselves subservient to those basic rules of nature, keh lein.
ठीक है.
And they help them understand something which is cause and effect. And those become the basis for how they behave and how they think and how they interact. Ye to primary intangible limitations हैं इसकी. And once they interact, then we can understand, the social scientist or student of social science can try to then conceptualize. So conceptual is something which has more than one term. It's binary, so to speak. It combines two or more than two. So it begins from that. The term theoretical has to then focus on conceptual logic, deduction. So logical has to comply to things which are rule-based, which are intangible, and how people respond to those. Observation of those leads to some kind of deduction. And this logic and deduction is then used to develop some kind of term which is more dense than a simple left, right, or a simple term such as color or number. So theorization basically begins with logic, deduction, and development of the conceptual. And that conceptual is then used to then make certain primary assumptions. That if we see these circumstances fixed, these peoples with this interest fixed, in confronting this kind of eventuality, then the likely response will be this. So then theorization is based on what they observed and coming up with something which is more dense. Now, that is not an easy thing. And that is why we have a strong belief in what theory is, and it is something to be considered seriously and to be employed. Because conceptual things don't come about, nobody imposes them on people. Those are things which gradually over a long period of time find their presence and their acceptance among people.
Through the contribution of many people.
हाँ, एक objectivity जिस तरह से आ जाती है ना. So once we say it is something, the people basically believe in them. And it's not that somebody has told them to believe in them. They have over the years gone through various phases which have materially changed the society around them, which have changed their thought and the medium of their thought as well, meaning the language. So as language evolves, realities of social organization become real to people. And theories represent those things, mere khayal mein. And they help us make primary claims about social behavior.
सही है.
Which जो research वाले students करते हैं, hypothesize. So if you develop those hypotheses, then you're able to then test them empirically. So basically theory का ये concept है, individual groups or IR में भी.
बिल्कुल.
So when we say IR theory, it does not mean that you learn theories and you start using them to apply on state behavior. You look at the state behavior and you see the pattern and try to come up with what you think is the concept and then lead to your theorization. In that way, IR theory is then a logico-deductive system of analysis, identifying concepts and variables and making assumptions which can empirically be tested.
तो हम जो टर्म यूज़ करते हैं theories, तो हमारे माइंड में आता है नेचुरली कि जी रियलिज्म है theory और liberalism है etc. But after listening to this answer, I can say that shorter terms such as balance of power, etc., are also theories.
Yes, balance of power, in fact, is seen as one of the very credible theories of IR.
As a part of realism.
Yes.
A brief introduction to IR theories, and I personally find the most interesting to be realism. I don't know why, but I suppose the reason is that it is more relative to South Asia. Wars and conflicts are happening over here and realist paradigm dominates sort of naturally. So if I were to ask a very basic वैसे possible नहीं है, उसके साथ injustice है, लेकिन an introduction to realism.
I think obviously it is traced to Thucydides. Thucydides, it's also pronounced, the Peloponnesian War. But I think another very useful work is by Sheldon Solomon, Terror Management Theory.
Right.
He gives a good interpretation. Realism pe aa rahe na. I'm going to go to the basis of real. So realism, IRP students basically believe, just as uske postulates hain, all the way from Thucydides to, let's say, Hobbes, usse pehle Machiavelli hai. So they develop some basic ideas about human nature, what guides them. You know, you said that it appeals to me. Ek assumption hai realism mein that the true behavior of individuals can be judged if they are in a state of conflict of interest over the same thing.
जी.
ठीक है? And that is something which most students find very, very real and interesting. That, you know, all friendship, all states, common interests, all fine and well, but if their interests clash and their survival depends on that, then they're likely to follow a behavior which realism explains best.
बिल्कुल.
Sheldon Solomon in Terror Management Theory basically relates to and asks a basic question. He talks about the basis of real. And to him, his assumption is that the ultimate reality that people accept is that their lives are likely to end at any stage.
बिल्कुल. ठीक है.
And this is the thing which guides the whole interpersonal, and the worldview. At any moment can be there.
Solomon is from the recent?
Yes. नहीं, इतना recent भी नहीं, इतना पुराना भी नहीं है. And this is a very good work to look at. Although traditional realism में ये चीज़ नहीं पढ़ाई जाती. Why? Because he is not a political scientist, ना anthropologist है. And anthropology को IR वाले think कि वो एक और discipline है. So I think ये उसकी basis है. और ये ना Thucydides ने उसकी interpretation से ये बात कही है. When he explains the Peloponnesian War, he says Thucydides is suggesting this, that this terror that people feel as a result of realizing that they are mortal leads to them creating something which transcends mortality. जिसको social groups कहते हैं.
So, yeah.
Something which is likely to make their name last even when they die. So social groups are formed for this, something to identify with. He was so and so, he belonged to that tribe, that nation, he wrote this and that, eternity. Uske liye. So this is what can be seen as a good historical, philosophical, anthropological explanation to that. Traditionally, realists talk about survival. Machiavelli talks about four main sentiments: fear, hatred, क्या था आपको याद है? Contempt and love. Fine?
Fear and love, yes.
Fear, hatred, contempt, and love. He says love and fear are the most strongest if you can induce that. So they're looking at the individual, classical realists. Hobbes goes to a further extent and suggests that war of man against man, warre, Leviathan can be created, competition, diffidence, quest for survival. So you see focus on this as the reality.
So, yeah.
And then based on that, they make some basic postulates that all springs of actions are inherently subjective. There's no ultimate moral law, no ultimate moral end to which our human appetites are insatiable. So people see that as relating to them, provided they come to this primary circumstances, this primary frame where their interests are clashing with other people's interests.
Interest is supreme for them.
So, interest सबका है, लेकिन अब एक चीज पे दो का क्लैश हो जाएगा तो फिर क्या नेचर होगा उनका, और वो रियलिज्म ज्यादा बेहतर. आइडियलिज्म कुछ और बात करता है, यूटोपियनिज्म, लिबरलिज्म, दे एक्सपेक्ट कि ये चीज किसी हद तक कम की जा सकती है. With this inherent drive for survival, prone to being prone to conflict, acquiring more in order to acquire a relatively prestigious status. So power is understood by seeing how many resources you have, but then that doesn't end there. It's not just a question of being ensuring your survival, but then some kind of a primacy among those who are your contemporaries. So in that way, realism appeals to a lot of people. So if you see states in a conflict, then naturally it is on a few things, and mostly it's resources and superiority over other or prestige. And realism gives a good explanation. So it's understandable that many students see that as a good theoretical approach. Now, the question of theory. So how is it a theory? It begins with a few presumptions about social behavior. It looks at certain circumstances where variables can be put together. In these circumstances, this is how people are likely to behave. And they make certain predictions about what will happen. So cooperation is all fine and well, but if it comes to survival, then ultimately your allies are not likely to ensure you. You're likely to. Economic prosperity is all fine and well, Rendell Schweller. But if it comes to the question of distribution of resources, and if that leads to tension and conflict, then ultimately war, then it won't be economic astuteness which will help you in that situation. It will be your military preparedness which will help you.
ठीक है.
So in that way, reality of international relations shows this is how it goes, and this is why many students are more interested in studying realism and applying that to study whatever they want as their research
और ये
project.
इस जियोग्राफी पे भी डिपेंड करता है. फॉर इंस्टेंस कोई यूरोपियन यूनियन में रह के आईआर को पढ़ रहा है तो शायद उसको लिबरलिज्म ज़्यादा अपील करे रियलिज्म की नस्बत. साउथ एशिया में अभी भी कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स चल रहे हैं, पार्टीशन से इवॉल्व हुए हुए कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स, और यहाँ के स्टूडेंट्स, यहाँ के एकेडमिक्स शायद समझते हो कि नहीं जी ये ज़्यादा हकीकत है. इसका कोई इम्पैक्ट होता है?
Absolutely. So if we say European Union, it didn't just come about like that. There's a long history of these ideas, Kantian thought primarily, perpetual peace, so may begin Freuden. So if you go and talk to them, you see that very clearly as a conviction that they are more inclined towards liberalism, open economics, democracy, representative democracy, and that makes sense to them in many ways. So if they talk about cosmopolitan world, so it was quite funny. I went and talked to Professor David Held and I said that it's not really much in currency in Pakistan. He said, yes, it doesn't work there. So it was a bit of a thing to laugh about, that obviously it appeals to them because they see the similar states around them.
They see it happening.
और दूसरा है कि एक बड़ी लंबी फेज है, एग्रेरियन रेवोल्यूशन, इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन, पोस्ट इंडस्ट्रियल, कैपिटलिस्ट, मॉडर्न, एंड यू डोंट सी द डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज हैविंग गॉन थ्रू दो स्टेजेस, जो मॉडर्नाइजेशन का थीसिस है. That is, but I would not say that realism appeals more to us. So realism actually is coming from the American academia with a very strong intensity now, Mearsheimer and all of the others. They give a very realist explanation of China, Russia, United States in current times. So it's not restricted to
South Asia.
Isके
बाद there is liberalism, liberal cosmopolitanism. Should we discuss these briefly? Is it?
We can do that. So liberalism, मेरी understanding ये है कि till Locke, liberalism, utopianism, idealism was the dominant paradigm उस वक्त. So how do we talk about economic prosperity, welfare, या जो which is at the core of idealism, ideal. How can something be agreed upon which can be globally magnified and globally set up, such as global peace, global welfare, global identity, citizenship, global sustainability, आजकल कहा जा सकता है.
सही है.
So Locke basically was talking about, fine, if you economically liberate people, he talks about theory of right of ownership, property, theory of value, which Locke gave in treatise. And I think that became the basis for liberalism, to liberate people. Liberalism not as do whatever you want, but to economically liberate them. And then you see that very significantly becoming the basis of how political economy evolved as a discipline in IR, subdiscipline in IR. So you see economists talking about sociology, politics, and classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, say Marx. If you look at the economic side of Marx's works, he talked about from the classical Marxist, classical economist point of view. And then you see neoclassicals, but then Hayek and Keynes. And Keynesian economic model, I think, is the economic infrastructure for the actual implementation, creation, and regulation of modern neoliberalism. So liberalism begins from, I think, from Locke, and you see the role of economists and Keynesian model more so in current times. Although there is an effort to revive Hayekism as well, very subtle, very benign, but it's going on. And the problem is that it's very difficult to implement the way he visualized an economic model. So liberalism would be that. A relative, I'd say, critique of this is what some writers are talking about as liberal militarism.
Right.
Where we see the use of war to then be seen as justified if post-war reconstruction will be along the lines of liberalism. And that the critique of liberalism in the form of liberal militarism suggests that then it has not only given credence to this idea that war can be waged in order to then bring about an economic change, but that leads to a control by what is at the core of modern liberalism and Keynesianism, capitalism. Capital entrepreneurs taking a lead in the development of military hardware, its actual use in the arena of war, and that giving them the role of how these have to be employed in the theater of war, in some ways surpassing what the generals should be doing.
ठीक है.
So it's a marketization of war in that way, which then means is how Brian Mabee and Alejandro Colas have done in some of their works, how you see modern post-9/11 wars fought in a manner that corporates are in many ways influencing the way the actual tactics of war are going. And in basic manner where we see in spirit is a very abstract and a very ambitious and a very idealist term. The way liberalism as a doctrine began and from the Lockean thought, these in many ways contradict that basic idea. The way Locke argued liberalism's purpose should be. I think many people say that Marx is not relevant anymore. If you look at two or three of his very basic criticisms, they're still very much relevant.
Right.
Very advanced, if you see them advanced, meaning the way Veblen, Semel, modern Marxist writers such as Alex Kalinicus, economists such as Kostas Lapevitsas have very clearly added Marxist criticism of liberalism and capitalism, then comes into conflict with how. And basically then liberation would mean that war has to be eliminated. So liberal militarism then advocates in some ways war. So yeah, dusri side. Cosmopolitanism, I wouldn't say liberal cosmopolitanism, because it is more with the way Kantian thought was. So although cosmopolis term goes all the way back to De Civita Dei, St. Augustine in his works, The City of God, so uses the term cosmopolis. In Zum ewigen Frieden, The Perpetual Peace, Kant talks about these as well.
जिसकी एक evolution चल रही है idea की.
जी. आजकल के cosmopolitans Kant को interpret कर रहे हैं. They're interpreting Kant. So Kant talked about a global civil society, but then he gave very basic principles of how that can be attained. So just like you said, European states, a common history, a heritage, common aspirations, some kind of worldview that they had. Many things
steps.
Common as. So it made sense to them, a model which then could be used. And then it's a bit different from globalization. Global is restricted to this globe. Cosmopolis is then the cosmos. Basis of that is the cosmos. So वो बहुत एक ambitious idea था.
Right.
So Kant basically is to be placed among the transcendental idealists. Not liberal, थोड़ा सा different. Liberal cosmopolitan भी मेरा थोड़ा सा हो गया. I'd say cosmopolitan, liberal internationalistic term उसके करीब आती है किसी हद तक. So modern cosmopolitans would then interpret Kant suggesting that in perpetual peace, that an injustice in one part of the world is experienced by everybody, everywhere, suggesting that people are moving in a manner, the social evolution is going in such a manner that at some stage, the borders of the states will merge and it will lead to a global civil society, a cosmopolis. The other responsibility that he in some ways suggested was, was the collective security. So an injustice in one part of the world can be seen and experienced by everyone everywhere is interpreted, especially post 9/11, by modern pro-war cosmopolitans such as Ulrich Beck, such as Daniel Archibugi, such as David Held, not as much Mary Kaldor, because Mary Kaldor talked about such intervention under strictly the supervision of United Nations. So modern cosmopolitan case for war was based on this, that such a breach of natural law demands humanitarian intervention. And this was employed by United States as academics to advocate the post-9/11 war in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think the ones that I've met, readers of philosophy, academics of philosophy, would say that we don't think Kant would have gone to that extent of saying that this demands a preemptive war or even preventive war, that for creating a cosmopolis, the liberal states, the free world has to or should wage war.
एंड आफ्टरवर्ड्स देयर इज मार्क्सिज्म. लेकिन उससे पहले आपने एक बात की थी, मार्क्सिस्ट क्रिटिक ऑफ लिबरलिज्म. तो वो उसी से रिलेटेड है जो लिबरल मिलिट्रिज्म की आपने बात की.
ये है, बिकॉज मबी एंड कोलास हैव अ बिट ऑफ इंक्लिनेशन टुवर्ड्स मार्क्सिज्म, बट then there are variations of Marxism as well. Now, so Colas and Peter Garvin was also said that a term Marxist cosmopolitanism. They agree that this world is turning into a cosmopolis, but they also see the problem of class, of inequality, of capitalism, and the way the surplus is reinvested. Where is it reinvested? So Marx talked about in theory of surplus value in constant capital. So they see Marx, because Marx himself had a cosmopolitan tinge to what he said when he said, "Globe workers of the world unite." Exactly. What kind of a world would it be where the workers are united? It's a very cosmopolitan approach. So cosmopolitan Marxist critique of realism, liberalism, I wouldn't say. Capitalism, definitely. I was suggesting that in some ways, capitalism appears to have found some agreement with the way neoliberals are suggesting what the world should be. They see the problems in capitalism, and quite like Marx actually also expected that at some stage capitalism may reform itself, lead to some kind of a semi-autonomous type of a capitalism where the producers will also be consumers of commodities. But if you look at the critique of capitalism, it is very much there, Marxist critique. And if you see capitalism serving the cause or the objectives of neoliberalism, then obviously there's a conflict and contradiction there.
And there are many layers to these theoretical paradigms, very complex layers.
Gee. But if you look at the basic assumptions, then there is a limit to how the parameters that you have to draw in order to focus. Layers हैं, लेकिन इस तरह का नहीं है issue कि आपको कुछ ambiguity या uncertainty की तरफ ले जाए.
At the start of our conversation, almost at the start, you mentioned that there are some areas on which almost all of the theoretical paradigms agree. That this is what international relations is, and
theories
this is
of international relations.
Theories of, and this is how it should be. वो क्या है?
So I usually refer to another writer that I really like his works is David Boucher, Political Theories of International Relations, and it's his first chapter of his book, The Character of Political Theory, basically says that he gives an introduction of all of these theoretical paradigms. Yes. There's a few competing claims common in all.
Jee.
And so internal springs to action. There are primary motivations which lead to people's behavior.
So, yeah.
As they interact with each other, they form social groups, they form families, societies, and states, and there are every society has its own ethos, logos, pathos, and ethos. So there are certain ethical standards on those behaviors, on those actions. People are free to think what they want, that materializes, but all societies have certain ethical limitations to those.
So, yeah.
So then we talk about just on social facts की a body of knowledge, absolute ethical justice है आजकल के वक्त में. We believe that justice होना चाहिए, legitimacy, autonomy, representation, welfare, these things should be there. So at the moment we can say that they are there, not to say necessarily absolute, but they're there. And people believe in them. So they apply to the structures and the purpose of the structures, justice को deliver करने का, law application का, autonomy representation का. But once there is a contingency, circumstances are such that they are not served, then they appear to be too abstract from the contingencies to which they are meant to apply. And that demands a rethinking of those not part of the body of knowledge of social sciences, and then see how whether we can find better explanations or change the structure in order to get the purpose of that structure.
इसके बाद very interesting theory or sub-theory of in IR, a critique of mainstream IR, that is feminism. और वो ये कहते हैं कि जी males are dominating how the world is perceived from the lens of international relations. And if females take the lead, the world may become a better place. This is a very simplistic explanation of that.
Basically, this is what they say. And not just international relations, everything social is very masculinized, according to them. So we see interest, power, diplomacy, rights, everything as those who, a large body of those who talked about these were themselves men, and they could not be empathetic towards what women, unka ek claim hai, thought. And if women were more in decision making, then there are a few things which are very natural to women. Their sensitive nature, the motherhood, the experience of motherhood, those who go through motherhood, and their experience as a daughter, sister, mother, which means that their worldview, their sensitivities, their own personalities are relatively different from the way the whole social scientific knowledge, according to their point of view, is masculinized. And that suggests that the way men approach all of these problems takes few things as given, that men are supposed to be, in some ways, ready for war, conflict ko justify kar jata hai, or they are supposed to be responsible economically and politically, and the way society defines laws and what should be done. And in that way, it in many ways restricts, or there's a deficiency in the way a large number of individuals in the societies think differently, have approached differently. So if societies, all knowledge is included feminist explanations, then there'd be simply lesser cases of war, lesser cases of coercion, usurpation, ये उनके एक point of view है. लेकिन उसमें भी थोड़ी सी एबरेशन आ जाती है. जिस तरह से मैंने जो feminist से मेरी interaction हुई, for instance, in my university was Najia Ali, Gender Studies Department, Nicola Pratt, Ilahi Brustumi Povi. So their works also focused on this and also showed how this has now been corrupted. How there's a feminist case for imperialism and war.
Right.
So the emancipation of women requiring war. Just to say Indian, I'm not sure whether she's Indian, but the name sounds a bit. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. Huh? Yeah. So the modern version of feminism and the imperialism of the West is the white man saving the brown woman from the brown man. So you see that as a bit. So Ilahi Rustumi Povi's work, Najia Ali, not this kind, what kind of liberation? And Ilahi Rustumi Povi's works about Afghanistan and the justification to wage war to liberate the Afghan women did not actually materialize the way it was developed in the discourse.
Exactly.
So ये है इसका. But I think personally that there is some truth to this as well. It's in the way social sciences we take few things, IR especially, as given. War, coercion, dominance, primacy, are one of our local, I'd say, was very intelligent and intellectual woman, Asma Jahangir, late Asma Jahangir. So she said that if you'd go and ask women of Pakistan, what do they think of this brutality of the police over women and children? So you go and ask a mother. So they die when they see these things. So ये एक बहुत बड़ा बॉडी ऑफ थॉट है जो कि सोशल साइंटिफिक नॉलेज और डिस्कोर्स में नहीं है. तो टू दैट डिग्री it is like, but also like I said, there's an element of how it can be, it can deviate from the original.
Do you think it has something to do with power? For instance, female scholars or female leaders are saying that things would improve if we come into power. But as soon as they come into power, the power dynamics, the authority attached to it, makes them as the males used to behave. Power corrupts.
Firstly, we don't have a lot of such examples of them actually coming to power to the degree that they can actually make very significant changes.
Data ki kami
One of
hai.
my students has just recently completed her MPhil dissertation on women's seat in Pakistan and why they are you properly utilized, and even if they come to power, they cannot do much about women's issues in Pakistan.
Right.
Fine. ये जो आप कह रहे हैं थोड़ा सा उसमें ऑरवेलियन भी टिंज है, एनिमल फार्म वाला. दे बिगिन विद हिज रेवोल्यूशनरीज एंड देन दे एंड अप बीइंग एज दोज. मेरा हमेशा ये ख्याल होता है कि दोनों एक्सट्रीम्स के दरमियान में कुछ होना चाहिए. ये भी बड़ा वी डोंट नो कि इफ दे कम टू दैट level of power that they can actually bring a change, what is likely to happen. Not that, predict. Nor them being subjugated forever, but given proper representation to the degree that there can be an inclusive discourse and dialogue and actually some role in policy making. So, wo to bare minimum hai na, that should be the case. And so should be the case in scholarship as well.
So the data is not sufficient to make a claim here?
There is no data. I don't know of any.
Afterwards, we will talk about constructivism in detail. But at this stage, what is the theoretical paradigm that most appeals to you as an academic? Constructivism?
I have done a lot of work in a way that I included that in my relatively advanced studies. But if I were to place myself somewhere, obviously the work that I've done and which has been published and has found some place is my own point of view, and which was the reason why I started working with this academic at SOAS, which is critical realism. So it's a combination of Marxist and realist basic assumptions and focus downs on those. In some ways, it appeals to me because of my study of realism and Marxism as well. And not because I just ended up reading them, because of my own interest I started them. And constructivism in some ways because it gives a relatively better explanation about how social formations evolve, how interests are defined, how people converge on few things which they find as dear to them, making sense to them, and how in some ways we can see the role that they play in how people behave. So my claim is that you have to then put a limit to that as well. Yes, they do play a role in how people develop discourse, set interest, and then not necessarily guide their behavior towards that interest, even if it means them not attaining that interest or losing out on something, or at the risk of losing what was set as their interest. So constructivism, I think, is in many ways very evolving, a very significant new field of study in IR. But like I said, if I were to be asked simply, this is where I place myself as critical realism, which is explained in this work as well.
To begin with, an explanation of constructivism, and then we'll move on to ideas, norms, identities, जो इसके further concepts हैं जो इसको shape कर रहे हैं. Constructivism के central premise क्या है?
जिस तरह से उसके term है construct. So, central premise is all social sciences a social construction, which leads to the construction of a social reality. So, I've been alluding to that from the beginning. So, they will see what are the very basic types of bodies of knowledge which we regard as social scientific knowledge, which includes all of the disciplines then. Is there any other type of knowledge? ये मेरा अपना personal view है, which people believe in, जो कि शायद socially constructed now. Is there any other type of knowledge that people regard as influencing them, their thought and their behavior is also a part of their focus in my view, which is the divine knowledge given to people. But they're not questioning whether it is divine or not. I feel that they are looking at the way that body of knowledge and the belief in the believer in that knowledge influences his thought, his actions as his interpersonal relations. So their focus is not keeping aside, because it's a relatively rational, in some ways, practical, beginning from practical and rational point of view, constructivism. So something which is not observable, quantifiable, will not be in its remit. But because it's there, so they are more interested in how social knowledge is constructed and how it leads to the creation of a social reality, how social facts evolve. So a good example is to look at the beginning, Nicholas Unaf, then there is Emmanuel Adler has then very nicely compiled all of these. Jutta Valdez is very good, seeing how she traces how constructivism developed. So how is social scientific knowledge constructed? They focus on the social world as composed of material objects, material things, large group of people. People are then part of that those material world. And they've their own identities, their own histories, their own ideologies, own aspirations. So there's a material world excluding people, and then there is a subjective knowledge of that material world that people have.
Okay.
So that subjective knowledge, like, if you can relate that, I'd like to do that. I mean, you can see how Freud has developed this idea of heterogeneous impacts on psychology, heterogeneous psychology of an individual. Okay. On individual, there are various hetero type of influences, who we are, which gender we are born in, what trait that we come to, what language we speak, where we live, various influences. And as different people with different influences form groups, then as a result of them engaging in enterprise about economics, aesthetics, literature, politics, their subjectivities tend to merge as intersubjectivities and lead to some kind of a homogeneity, which he calls as in group psychology and the analysis of ego, as a homogeneous psychology of a group. So there are people with their subjective knowledge about the material world and themselves, and as they interact in the form of groups, then there's some element of mergence of those subjectivities, because they're talking about the material world and the purpose they set for it and how it can be attained. And that leads to an intersubjective understanding. So there's material world, subjective knowledge, and intersubjective understanding.
Okay.
And this is a result of language being used. So people with different languages, perhaps, you can see the case in Pakistan, once they're talking about something specific and using one language, this is my understanding of constructivism, it leads to them highlighting, let's say, I think of this in A, B, C, and D, 4 factors. A Baluchi says something else, a Pakhtun says something else. And out of those total of 8 or 10 or 15 or 16 factors that we've brought on the table, there'll be a convergence of all of those group on, let's say, at least 4. This is the very basic prerequisite of this, what we're trying to observe as social behavior and what should be done. Mm-hmm. And that will be the point of uniting them. So language and use of words in language have various dimensions. They have words which have meaning and implications, and there's an illocutionary, as the linguists say, dimension to language, doing something by saying something. A volition as well in some ways. So that leads to those subjectivities merging. As the language plays a very significant role, it's a medium of thought as well. We think in images, and we also actually are thinking in language, the words. That applied on individuals leads to some things which they believe as, like in other terms which I used as rules, cause, effect, and norms, something which is seen as moral, becoming the basis of their interests, their reason as the Urdu word mantak would go, or logic, and their actual intentional acts. So once you see a society evolve politically, economically, legally, and in all other manifestations, then people intentionally do something to attain something. So once all of these interests are developed, reason and intentional acts, they are a result of use of language and the application of this discussion and discourse and intersubjective understanding on the material reality. So, this is what Adler in Constructivism and social and international relations says. So this is how the individual level goes. Structures are created to serve the interest, to give reason for those, and to give people intentional acts, to give them a guide to what they can do and attain something. Once the same are international, so once structure is created, it is based on something which is seen as workable, practical, sustainable, but more so normative, in some ways moral. So norms become the basis of those social relations creating structures at the domestic level. But that doesn't stop there. Once it is internationalized, you see the same structures evolving at the international level. A court system domestically, international court of justice, a market domestically, international type of a market, a representative body, UN. And those become the basis of international practices that they can then ultimately influence states' behavior, which ultimately trickles down to the individual. So this is what social sciences basically is, to try to understand that body of knowledge which people have themselves created, which unites people, which holds them together, which changes their perceptions, their interests, and their behaviors, and which then magnifies and evolves at the international level, and then has the ability to, like a new knowledge produce, new circumstances demanding new interpretations, changing states' practices. It will be acceptable to the states because the leaders are the same people who, beginning from the individual level, have reached that state of being decision makers, representing the state. And once they trickle down to the individual level, then it's a homogeneous, very integrated kind of a structure, individuals creating social knowledge, leading to the creation of a social reality. So all of those terms which we talk as social are real to people.
So I have two questions here. First one is that if we talk about Pakistan and the various provinces it has and the various languages people use in Pakistan, do you think that we are not able to gather around what is right and what is wrong regarding how Pakistan should be run because of the barrier of language? The language is such an important thing, in my opinion, that it is preventing the people of this country, or maybe any other social group, from uniting around a certain definition of how things should be done. Is it applicable in this case?
I don't think, my personal experience is that you go to a very, very remote part of Pakistan, not very, very remote, but still a remote part, people can communicate and talk to you in Urdu, basic Urdu.
Yeah.
My personal experience.
Yes.
Okay. They have their own mother tongue. A linguist such as Tariq Rahman would say that it's not necessarily bad for people to learn more than one language. I mean, practically, an average Pakistani student is confronted, is negotiating, wrangling with 4 languages.
Yes.
Till the age of 10. Their mother tongue, then Urdu, which is most people talk in, Then there is the syllabus, which in English medium schools is English, and they have to learn that. And being Muslims, they have to learn the Quran as well.
Yes.
See, Arabic is another language. Most of us can read, not always write, but those who've been taught.
They can read.
So Tariq Rahman's basic idea is that primary basic education should be in the mother tongue. So once they get to understand the implication and meaning of the word, my understanding of it is, they'll relatively be in a better position to know the purpose of those. I think what you're saying, मैं कोई linguist नहीं हूँ, but I think is that they have a basic understanding, but there's a huge leap that they take when they come to a stage when they talk about a national discourse in Urdu. It's not necessarily bad to encourage regional languages and an understanding of what should be identity, justice, and all of those things, and then perhaps talking in Urdu. Mera khayal hai. I don't see that as a problem necessarily, that Urdu or are trying to combine people with different languages, imposing the discourse in Urdu is a problem. But the reason why we've seen them being together is not solely language. There are various clear economic things and interests which unite these people together. There's religion, of course. There's a huge cultural forming tendency of religion. So constructivism is something very new, but it has given shape and a theory to something which is centuries old. So it's too, I'd say, ambitious, or in some ways it's too...
It's a huge project.
नहीं, वो जो मैं कहना चाह रहा हूँ कि ये इससे बहुत ज़्यादा एक्सपेक्ट करने वाली बात. It's too much of an expectation to say that constructivism will help us explain the problem here. The problem is here. It's not such a... मगर ये सिर्फ वो नहीं है जो आप कह रहे हैं, मेरे ख्याल से. ये प्रॉब्लम सिर्फ इसका नहीं है जो क्या, जिस तरह से आपने कहा, क्वेश्चन क्या था कि उर्दू की वजह से
नहीं, लैंग्वेज की वजह से.
लैंग्वेज की वजह से. आई डोंट थिंक दैट इज द एक्चुअल प्रॉब्लम. द अदर प्रॉब्लम आर वेरियस अदर, पॉलिटिकल, इकोनॉमिक, मोर सो देन द लैंग्वेज. और मेरा एक्सपीरियंस ये है कि लैंग्वेजेस छोटी एज में आप काफ़ी ज़्यादा सीख सकते हैं. सो इफ़ लिंग्विस्ट को बीच में बुलाया जाए ना, तारिक रहमान हैड अ गुड explanation for that. If you call the linguist in and pose this question to them, they'll give you an answer. What can be done, practically can be done.
And the second question was, do you think that Pakistan's or South Asians' behavior towards international politics is the way European Union has come into reality, but at the same time South Asia is mired into conflict? Do you think that language is playing a role here as well? But I think I have gotten the answer from the previous, answer to the previous question. Okay, there are many factors involved.
I think another of my friend did a work which I found quite interesting, but it poses a very big question. Which his assumption was that Pakistan should be more identifying with the Stan states, historically. Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. There are many things common. Urdu language has more of Persian, Arabic, Turkish words. Then it has Gurmukhi, Sanskrit or Prakrit words. You see that as a very, very significant change, especially after the British. That you see us more now, we see Urdu and Hindi as similar. Although Gurmukhi was the basis for Punjabi, it's much ancient language. Many words in Punjabi are those which became a part of Urdu. So you see more of an inclination of Pakistan and our identity with Hindi than with Persian or Turkish or Arabic or any other of those languages which include these, or perhaps Kurdish or any other. So that could have been one. I think basically this is one of the reasons why we see a bit of a problem. Just now, regional integration, रीजनल इंटीग्रेशन के एक उस तरफ से गैप है जहाँ से शायद हमारी आइडेंटिटी थी, उसका पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है. इट्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट नाउ. तो इफ़ आई आस्क यू टू से एनी सेंटेंस इन उर्दू, there'll be many words whose history you could trace to Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Gurmukhi and Prakrit and Sanskrit as well, but not as much as the others. But we are not in connection with those languages anymore. And what you were saying demands that could be the connecting thing.
That may be a suggestion from this discussion of ours.
And which is very difficult now. लेकिन एक सबसे बड़ा जो मसलन क्वेश्चन है, जो like said के 4 languages. One of my friends, Enrico Casai, was doing his PhD in linguistics, and he was from Sardinia.
Sardinia
is a small island south of Italy.
Right.
So they are Italians in some ways, but historically they're more Mediterranean. And the time when Muslims ruled over them, there's lots of Islamic traditions and cultures which have gradually become a part of the Sardinian culture. So his thesis was basically about Arabic and some words which became part of their language and custom. So he asked me a simple question: Ahmed, you and your friends can read and write Arabic. I said, yes, I can read and I can also write, but not all can read. Can you not talk to all Muslims in Arabic? So I said, how can you learn a language, read it, but not be able to communicate? So, ये एक बड़ा main question है to teaching and pedagogy. How can you cram in some ways a language? This is the kind of approach we've seen in the past couple 100 years, which has, I think, put limitations on how language ought to have been learned. And if had that been the case, then perhaps what you're suggesting could have been possible.
Then there are discourses in IR, and one of the central premise is that discourses, we have been referring to discourses as languages up until now. How do they affect international politics? What does constructivism say about that? And at the same time, a small comment on discourse analysis as well.
The discourse, my understanding is a bit more evolved from narrative. Narrative is not necessarily, if you see how people's thought is changed as a result of them listening to the other, something of a, if I may say, Hegelian type of a synthesis and thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, something like that. Discourse analysis, content analysis, basically look at how words are used, how implications of words suggest what should be done. A simple example of discourse is how we see in modern times, let's say, when we're looking at Putin invading Ukraine, and you see a bit of a reference to appeasement. So appeasement was a policy at the time when Hitler started his expansion. And Joseph Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, was the advocate of appeasement. And it did not, well, it failed actually. It was associated with pacifying an aggressor.
Yes.
So when you see use of such words for Russia, it's an implication that don't try to pacify this aggressor.
ठीक है.
It's going to end up the way it ended up when we tried. So you see Anschluss, Lebensraum, all of those terms used the way the Nazis were expanding. You see how Napoleon invaded Russia and how Russians, before the winter setting in, burnt all of the villages and all of the grain, and they ended up getting to Moscow, but they were freezing and then to death, and they had to retreat. And the term used was scorched earth policy.
Yes.
So they were burning. History man. So you see that term used by first Bush, John Herbert Walker Bush, when he was confronting Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. So when Saddam was leaving Kuwait, he was burning all of those wells, oil wells. And he used the term, the scorched earth policy of Saddam Hussein, suggesting that we're not going to go after him. There'll be something like falling into a trap. Is had tak international relations, may we see the role of discourse, how terms are used, and the implication, historical implication of those terms. Relatively thick conceptual words which have a whole long, very strong resonance through history. Constructivists will go to the extent of suggesting that as people start engaging in discourse, it changes their way of thinking. They're not talking about this term, and specifically constructivism may not being but becoming. The object of the discourse evolves. The discourse itself evolves, and our understanding of what we're talking about evolves. And we are continuously in a process of changing the perception of the other. When we say, I've convinced A or B, constructivists would say, I've changed his preferences. He prefers something else now as a result of my changing his perception. So, constructivists would go to the extent of saying that we are all problem solvers in some manners. We see a reality, and we are trying to minimize the gap between what we see as the reality and what we want to attain out of that reality. And discourse, changing of perception, helps us do that. So in that way, when we see the nature of the discourse evolving, people's behaviors, preferences change. And why people did one thing and not the other can also be understood by making a comparison of what the object of the discourse was prior to the beginning of discourse and how it evolved into something once the discourse gradually evolved to its high point. If we deconstruct that, we can in some ways see that as a guide to why people did this, not the other.
ठीक है.
ये constructivists कहते हैं discourse analysis का role of discourse.
And does it apply to Pakistan and India as well?
Some people have done that. One of my students is working on that, how nuclear issue and how constructivism helps us understand how we interact with India and how there are certain images and how images change. Not a lot of work has been done on that because of the primary effect that there's a very lingering mistrust and lack of discourse and dialogue between India and Pakistan. If it were there, then perhaps we could research into how images are, what images are, and how perhaps new images are evolving and whether or not they're likely to affect.
एक और इंसिडेंट था, once you were invited to a model talk show in SPIR, and one of the students, while asking a question, he used the term Uyghur terrorists. He referred to Uyghurs as the terrorists. And then you commented on it while giving the feedback that such terms should be used carefully so that we do not become part of that discourse. And it relates to the topic at hand, discourses. So we call it, and you called it, political correctness. I would like you to comment on this term for public awareness, for all of the listeners who are watching this show, that why is it important to take the terms very seriously that we use in our daily discussions, whether it is our personal discussions, whether it is on television, or maybe in writings and research as well. Political correctness.
People use those terms. Fine. I think it's important it's a job of the academics in some ways to, at that point, very clearly define that this has this kind of an implication. It must not be a part of the discourse now. So if you look at the individual level, the way we start thinking, we start seeing the words which we have in our mind becoming a part of our language, is a very subtle line. It's a very slippery kind of a terrain there.
Yes.
And once we see those terms used, they primarily are seen as indicative of how we think, and they become a part of the discourse and gradually are then, without our knowledge, becoming a part of how we identify something, place something, frame an issue. I was just listening to another of your with Naila.
Naila Chauhan.
And she talked about, asked about whether as a child you talked about eeny, meeny, miny.
Yes.
Nigger.
Yes.
So nigger, very simply, was seen as Negro. Negro as an African. became a term suggesting something, thoda sa sense of condescending.
Yes.
Catch a nigger bites book. मुझे तो याद है when we learned, we didn't know कि क्या इसका implication है, but then. So in that way, we see in some cases, discourses very systematically created in order to create a kind of opinion about. In my own work, for instance, I've mentioned how ये सिर्फ टर्म का यूज़ नहीं है, इम्प्लीकेशन का भी है. From California, Berkeley writers of the work A Matter of Principle, Thomas Cushman, are looking at the works of Sayyid Qutb. And Sayyid Qutb is being quoted as saying that there's huge injustice on the Muslim people, and the way to come out of that injustice is to give your life. Lay your life, give your life. In Urdu language, it would imply devote your life. In Arabic, it would imply the same. Why? Because if you're looking at from a strictly Islamic point of view, Islam does not allow you to commit suicide. So there's no other interpretation of it.
बिल्कुल ठीक है.
ठीक है. But if there's a discourse among those people who do not know that laying your life means devoting your life, because ending your life in a suicide is just not acceptable.
Such a mind-opening fact.
That will build a huge discourse that these suicide terrorists are guided by these Islamic writers and what Islam preaches, which is absolutely not the reality. So political correctness is not just the words, but how you suggest an implication with the actual text. So we see that occurring. So the term, simple C, quote I read somewhere, be careful about your thoughts, they may become words at any point. One.
Yes.
A Sufic quote, save yourself from your thoughts. So political correctness begins from there, but obviously once the words are uttered, then it becomes the job of those who are in, the responsibility of the academics, Chomsky ne jaise likha, is this political correctness ko continuously, there's an implication to this. Or to identify how someone perhaps is using a term for a very specific purpose. And in some ways that's an indicator to what they're thinking, how they have psychologically been oriented, and what their interest is. So, ये है थोड़ा सा.
The importance of language. Should we move to? Well, you just said that it is the responsibility of academics. Do you think in Pakistan some academics are working on this? That what sort of words, what sort of concepts, ideas are being communicated through academia, media, maybe social media, and what are its implications? Is there any serious or worth mentioning work being done in Pakistan?
I think there are a few people doing work in liberal arts department of Beacon House in Lahore. They are doing this. They are working with some very old establishments. Structures are groups here such as Ajoka Theatre as well. So there is some work being done there, to my knowledge. I don't know of any other, because not necessarily my field of study, but I know of one, which I've told you.
But we can say that it should be done. It's very important.
Absolutely.
Especially in this Sayyid Qutb wali aapne which was mind-blowing. We can move to the book now. We'll show the cover of the book. It is titled U.S. Foreign Policy and Gulf Wars, Decision Making and International Relations. And it's based on the theoretical paradigm of, you have employed that paradigm of constructivism?
Well, I began by a very simple question, which was how we can understand post-Cold War use of force by United States. That was my basic interest. That led to the theoretical and philosophical question about whether use of force can be morally justified. So that's another very theoretical part of this work. Then I began by obviously developing an academic explanation of this. So read all of the academics, relevant academics about this. So a huge discourse within realism, some within liberalism as well, especially post 911 cosmopolitan discourse as well. So I included all of those point of views. There was realism, liberalism, and cosmopolitanism. And there was some element of convergence of liberalism, internationalism, and cosmopolitanism, so they could be placed in one. And then obviously a simple answer to the primary question that realists are not interested in moral justifications of war. So focus more on that. You can keep that aside. So it's quite like now developing as a simple scientific experiment that you've got a structure against which two things can be tested, or more than two can be tested. So an experiment where metals can be tested and their densities can be. So you take two case studies. A good thing was that I was able to find commonalities. So there was a huge body of literature as well at that time where there were huge focus on preemptive war and trying to draw analogies from some literature coming from United States between Cuban Missile Crisis and post 9/11 chance of preempting Iraq. So comparisons had to be. The things which logically made sense is Saddam Hussein on one side, first Bush on the first case, and second Bush. So Republicans, neocons, Vulcans, Saddam. And that gave shape to it. It was very tempting to include Clinton as well and Cuban Missile Crisis as well, but you have to compile it.
Confine it and...
So did that, and then the empirical side is where you see discourse and content analysis. There are scholars, practitioners, something of an area where academic resonates in the policy making.
Okay.
And then you see actually what the documents are. So that's an upper limit. That's a fixing of that. A line that is drawn. Once they develop a document, then it shows what they think and what their policy is likely to be. Full stop. And then you see actually the materialization of the policies. What happens, which can be quantified, identified by looking at what happened, how much resources, where are they employed. So this was the then empirical side of it, a comparison of liberal cosmopolitanism, constructivist approach, and realism on the other side. And applying the theoretical to be related with the documents, the resonance of those terms, academic in the documents, and then empirical by actually the conduct of war and the outcomes of those. So the realists or the critique of realists who want to see or trace realism would be more interested in seeing what they said and the outcomes of what they did. And that is a good guide to the actual motivations of what the person was saying and what they actually did. So in that way, then you can see a final conclusion which substantiates the theoretical.
And critical realism, where does that...
So critical realism was my critical approach itself. It included the explanation of realism, the identification of material interest and discourse to masquerade the material interest. And the critique of liberalism and capitalism, Marx's critique of that as well. And if you try to find how that relates with constructivism, what the constructivists say, as Lenny Malvig, René Hansen talking about in Kosovo, Yugoslavia, how they claim discourse was a way how policies were then formulated. So Rwanda and Burundi, many millions died, many people died, but the intervention was more in Kosovo's case. It was there in Kosovo's case. Why? Because the discourse was developed in such a manner that it demanded intervention when we were talking about Kosovo, and not as much intervention when we were talking about the way the discourse about Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda was developed. So whether discourse guides behavior, or those states, we're not then talking about Saddam or a terrorist or an absolutist or a dictatorship, those states where the leaders are accountable to the people.
Okay.
And being the devil's advocate, thoda sa giving the devil its due, United States, you see that they are practicing democracy and actually accountable in some ways to the people. So in that way, it puts certain limitations to what they can and cannot do. But not necessarily guides their behavior. ये मेरा थोड़ा
और ये भी हो सकता है कि they are trying to do something and then they continue to generate discourses to make an impression that these discourses are coming from genuine sources like people or academics.
So Machiavellianism, just a Machiavelli, the way he says, is not suggesting that a powerful will do whatever he wants to do. He talks very clearly about keeping the face of a lion and acting like a fox. So something openly comes across as Machiavellian is not what Machiavelli advocated.
Any example from the work through which we can gauge the importance of constructivism? That in some specific case, discourses were generated and they laid influence on actions, they guided the behavior, or in some other case, whether a state wanted to do something and then it tried to generate discourses to justify that. Any specific example from the Gulf Wars, I suppose?
Gulf Wars, I have mentioned how discourse in the second case was used to substantiate their policy of entering Iraq, holding elections and all. And they used those terms specifically, removing tyrants, democracy and capitalism as the best form of government. But I think the bigger contribution in constructivism is that it puts into perspective how we see new social realities in the past couple of decades evolving. It's a better explanation in some ways. So the interests are not the way realists talk about as material and identifiable material, or the idealists and liberals talk about as global idealist, liberal as how the economic emancipation can be. Adler very nicely gives an example which I've quoted in my works as interests are ideas which are ontologically intersubjective and epistemologically objective interpretations about or of and for the material world. So if you see humanitarianism, ecological sustainability, human security, all of these terms have evolved as a good explanation is how through this they have evolved in this manner. So in constructivism, this explanation about social facts, norms, international practices, people's reasons, interests, and intentional acts gives a good explanation of how many things which were the focus of realism, liberalism, Marxism as well. Marx suggested something much better than the existing literature at that time, were explained. So that, I think, is a relatively bigger contribution of constructivism to IR scholarship.
We are just moving towards the conclusion of the discussion. And did we miss something? A very interesting question leading to a very interesting answer. What are you currently reading?
Surprisingly, I had put it off for a very long time, but I'm at the moment I'm reading Howard Zinn's The 20th Century, and obviously very good work. But then it also shows the people that he was associated with, mostly Noam Chomsky, Iqbal Ahmed as well. So we see anarchists and anarchism as well, Chomsky, and basically we're seeing them as a popular type of people who are suggesting some kind of change to the existing. And they have a very strong critique of how we see those which are the models at the moment. United States as a state and an empire. So that is what I'm at the moment reading. A good, refreshing for me, because very authentic, but not as much theorized, the way in Chomsky writes as well. His sources are very authentic, but not very, very dominated by traditional IR theory or other theories of social sciences.
And your all-time favorite read?
That's a very difficult question. But in IR, I think since I've been reading, one of the works which I really liked and I thought put many things which I had as questions in perspective was a work by Martin Wyatt, which is International Relations, the Three Traditions. And the excellent thing about it was that at that time I was trying to figure out how we can place these, develop these theoretical paradigms, and he gives a very good model. And I was reading more about Martin Wyatt as well. And I saw that that work was published after his death. So he had compiled it, but his wife, Gabrielle Wyatt, and one of his friends, they organized it and had it published. And I was wondering that it was a very, very excellent work. Why did he not publish during his lifetime? So I thought that perhaps was that his interest was not to get credit for what he has learned and to advertise all that he knows, but for someone else to do it after his own. I mean, it shows a bit of a kind of inclination of not trying to come out in the limelight and showing that this is what I know and all. And I thought that was one of the greatest influence on the way and obviously at that time when he was writing, it was very relevant. It's still very much relevant, and it's very authentic work. Then apart from that, I think one work which I've really, really enjoyed, and I've read it a couple of times, which I don't usually do with books, is Somerset Maugham's The Razor's Edge, which I thought was very good because the way he writes, and the way he writes is that he's continuously presenting what is going on and what the person is thinking in a very, very dense and very nicely articulated manner. And another work which I'm constantly in touch with is The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And I bought that book in 2007 from London's Waterstone, and I still haven't finished it. And it's on my bedside, and I read one quote after 1 or 2 days and contemplate over it. And reading, well, obviously there's another side. I read a ruku of Quran every day, and I read the meanings, the translation. And there are ayats like Surah Najm, Kalam, Qamar, Al-Buruj. So physicists astronomers would spend years trying to get to what, and many Islamic thinkers can tell us that. So it's not just merely the words, but trying to see the context in which those are said. And that is to me very interesting. The books comes to Martin Wyatt, Somerset Maugham, two which I've liked, Candide obviously, Voltaire, and Meditations, which is there. And if you were to ask me regularly what I read, the one Ruku from Quran, Meditations, and sometimes just pick up a book and read, but I don't have lots of books. Quite a few, but not a lot, and very selected. So yes, this question could go on for more than this.
For another
yes.
episode.
Yes.
Chale, thank you very much, sir, for being over here. We
thank you for inviting me. Yes.
We reflected a lot on theories, IR, but the most mind-blowing, well, many parts were mind-blowing, but a very interesting part was the Sayyid Qutb, wo wala part. Because it provides a real-world example of constructivism.
Yeah.
And how discourses are influencing us.
Yes.
Chale, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.